Come on, go!
My name's Tim. I'm a musician, a car collector, an automotive journalist, and a lover of all things automotive. I've bought and sold collectible cars for 2 decades, and I hope my experiences and my point of view helps you find the car of your dreams. The Chevrolet C4 Corvette is undeniably 80s. It was designed in a period where they were coming out of the C3 generation car, but they were really into this. They were sort of addicted to fiberglass on steel chassis design. And they took it a lot further with this car. So much so that it was, at the time, considered a visionary vehicle. But by 1989, GM decided they needed to be the king of the hill. And they leveraged their relationship with Lotus to do just that, to introduce the Corvette ZR-1, the king of the hill. Once you slide into the ZR-1's million-way adjustable seats, finished in lipstick red leather, it's a pretty comfortable place to be. That being said, these seats look amazing, but they're not up to the quality of a Recaro seat from the era. So in the inside of this vehicle, certainly there's some critiques to be levied at the Corvette. There's no question about that. Now, that being said, time has been really generous to this car. There's a time capsule element to the ZR-1, and I think particularly, at least for me, the 1990 ZR-1, that really hits me right. I've fitted this Momo wheel, which isn't to everyone's taste, but for me is pretty much perfect. For me, one of the things that drew me to this car as a kid is that clamshell front end. The ability to be able to look at everything mechanical, those Bilstein shocks, that LT5 with its 16-runner lobster intake on the top. I mean, the only cars that competed for my interest more when it comes to a clamshell is like an F40 or an 037. That's how much I love the beak of this ZR-1. And quad cam V8 power from Lotus, built by Mercury Marine, it was literally the cherry on top. And when you crank that open, you were able to look at it in all its glory. Most people, when they think of the 1990 ZR-1, think of the road and track road test in, I believe, 1990, like when the production car came out. For me, it was before that, and I want to say Automobile Magazine and Road and Track, and potentially even Car and Driver, got a chance to drive the car in Europe about a year before, I want to say sometime in 1989, and that article blew my mind. Now, I had a Chevy dealer right up the street from my house, like literally at the end of my street. And as I've said many times in these videos, I came up very poor. But Chevy seemed, attainable. The price point of the Corvette, even though it was literally doubled by the ZR-1 package, literally the package cost as much as the Corvette, but it was so worth it. And having the dealership at the end of the street, it seemed like, even though I fancied myself driving an F40 or a Testarossa, I thought, you know what, this new king of the hill car that Chevy has built could be the answer to an affordable dream car that I could actually own one day. And I remember I had a 1/24 scale model of the car, and that intake manifold was just absolutely stunning, absolutely unbelievable. And when this article came out on the car, it was incredible. It was like the quarter mile was 12.9, I remember. And I mean, nothing had a quarter mile. I mean, the F40 was like the only car. 0 to 60 and they said low 4 seconds. Absolutely nuttiness. And it would come to pass that the car would pull a G. It had 315s out back. Goodyear devised a tire specifically for this car called the Gatorback, which sadly are no longer in production. I can only imagine being a journalist at that time and driving this car, which for 60 grand was going to be literally the king of the hill, and it was going to be a United States vehicle. It's going to be an American car. Now, for me, being a fan of Lotus and of Ferrari and of European cars predominantly, one thing that absolutely, I'm going to sound like a Euro snob on this, but made it palatable to me was that Lotus did most of the design work on the car. GM had acquired Lotus, and it was one of those things where they had Lotus do a lot of the key design work. And when you drive this car, I had driven C4s before I had driven one of these. Absolutely, the first time I drove it, I could not believe how good it was, because I had spent years sort of, I'd driven an early C4 and I maligned these cars. They squeaked, they rattled, they had cheap interiors. Cheap interior, potentially, yes. Design-wise, I like the interior, but this car drove like Lotus at the pinnacle of their sort of Formula One success when they were acquired by GM. Did the development work on the engine. They built the first several LT5s. And again, this is a 5.7 liter quad cam 16 runner 3 throttle body V8 engine. At the time, I mean, you're talking like crazy European stuff. And you're also talking about an output of near 400 horsepower. And again, at that time, you have to think one of the other cars I really liked was the Volkswagen Scirocco. That car, it would end up being one of the first cars I owned, but that car had 124 horsepower. And I remember thinking, oh man, a 2-liter swap to get it to 134 horsepower would make sense. This was the era of like not a ton of power. So this car effortlessly made, high 300s, almost 400 horsepower. And this car has a tune on it. So it is making the 400 horsepower, it's a great car. Now, I will say everything that's great about this car when you initially drive it is the drivetrain. The drivetrain feels $1 million drivetrain. The engine feels special. It sounds special. Does not sound like a regular American V8, which, I mean, to me is an okay thing. The differential, and I talk a lot about differentials because I think the way a differential responds and is locked and shoots you out of a corner and allows the back to step around, that's a big thing to me, and this car has an amazing differential. It also has beautiful, again, developed by Lotus, suspension. The adjustable Bilstein dampers on this car, really the only other car in that era where you could find suspension like this would be a Ferrari or a Porsche. Like the Porsche 959 had similarly adjustable suspension, and it truly is dynamic. I will say, I personally find that driving it in the most aggressive performance setting suits my needs, and the softest setting is like grotesquely floaty. But yeah, it's unbelievable, and I think that you can see that Lotus heritage. Get a sharp eye, you can see that I've got a Lotus key fob on this car, and that's because I think when you drive this car, what's most apparent is that design work done by Lotus, performed by Lotus. I actually call it the Lotus ZR-1 a lot of times, or tag it hashtag Lotus ZR-1, because I think there's as much to do with what Lotus brought to the C4 Corvette as there is as what GM developed into the car. A lot of this car ended up becoming integral to the rest of the C4 line with regards to the tail, the transmission, those sorts of upgrades. Even the suspension eventually made its way into a regular C4. But I think the C4, and in particular the ZR-1, sort of paved the way for the C5 Z06, the C6 Z06, and these cars that became true legends in that they had amazing capabilities on the racetrack and on the street. I am a huge fan of this car. I actually am shocked how much I'm a fan of this car. I did not think I would like it as much as I did. I've owned hundreds of cars, and the ZR-1 is rated. It's rated up there. Now, a lot of the handling prowess, the first time I took one of my sons for a ride in this car, the one thing you notice is like there's so much tire under it that a lot of that grip comes from just how much tire there is. Now, there is no assistance of any kind in traction control on this car. One of the things that I like the most about the ZR-1 is the fact that it doesn't have traction control. When you drive this car on the limit, and I wish I could have driven it on the Gatorbacks. I feel like I currently have a real ridiculous sporty Nitto tire on it. Low tread wear number. It's almost too sticky for the car, too modern for the car. I feel like driving this on Gatorbacks would be even better. Personally, I like a little bit of slidey slide, as you know. This car being even a little more progressive on less grippy tires would probably be more to my driving taste. But what you get in this car in terms of provenance. I mean, it feels like a pedigreed car. And that honestly surprised me. I did not expect for this car to feel pedigreed. And a lot of the, the critiques, as you look here, yeah, there's exposed screw heads. Yeah, this is a bad piece of plastic. Yeah, the seat kind of creaks and those sorts of things. But honestly, the seat fits great. It's a very tight seat. This is crappy plastic. This is not nice plastic. There's a lot of not nice pieces in the car, but I mean, honestly, even BMWs from this era, or whatever you would pick as being your pinnacle vehicle from this era, say like the 500 SL that I'm a huge fan of, even those don't have great interior materials. I mean, clearly everything's moved on. The driving dynamic of this car is seriously surprising. And seriously, like if I could only have a few cars, like if I had to pare it back to, say 5 cars, I think the ZR-1 would be one of it. And this is someone that's coming from, like, again, I had a picture of Enzo Ferrari on my nightstand. Like, I mean, I'm a Europhile. Colin Chapman is like, Colin Chapman, Enzo Ferrari, these guys are guys that I revered. They're legends of motorsport, legends of European car manufacture. This car somehow gets in there for me. And I think the fact that it is built in Bowling Green, and that, everyone points out, and Merc Cruiser handled putting the engines together. They didn't design the engines. And I mean, I think Lotus was never going to have the capability to put together, the number of engines that GM wanted for this car. And I think the fact that they found someone that was so adept at aluminum technology that could meet the specifications in terms of tolerances. And these engines, they last and last and last. There's no shortage of beautiful aspects to this car. When you look around some of the things that, are not great points of the car. The styling, I think, has really come to its own. Even while I'm editing this video now, I love the way this car looks. And it makes me feel, very Motor Vice era feely vibes, almost in the same way that like a Countach or an Esprit does for me. Now, I'm not saying this car trumps a Countach and being like a superlative of that era, but I am saying like the rollover pop-up headlights, the huge dish on the back wheel of this car. I mean, the dish on the back wheel of this car is bettered only by like an XJ220. I could talk about it for days, and I think one of the reasons why is because I was so surprised by the car. Maserati good V8 sound with its quad cam goodness. That's 3,100 RPMs. Music in a late 80s, early 90s GM product. Torque everywhere. It's an amazing drive. It's an amazing drive. And I don't know why that surprised me, but it did. this car drives is unexpected. The Lotus genes are evident from the engine to the transmission to the setup. Everything about it feels very Lotus-like. And that is a steep compliment coming from me. I'll admit it, I used to be a C4 detractor. Early C4s rode pretty rough and were pretty miserable, but this was like a complete drivetrain swap. The engine, the ZF transmission, the rear differential, the suspension tuning, everything. You would buy a Corvette and then the ZR-1 package was the price of a whole nother Corvette. It literally doubled the price because that drivetrain transformed the Corvette. And it set the course for where Corvette would go in the future with the C5 Z06 and the C6 Z06, which is to say higher revving, closer to some of its European counterparts, and definitely track focused. I think these ZR1s are a smoking deal right now. And honestly, I wish I would have bought two like 2 years ago. If you always liked the C4, or if you never liked the C4 and you're just a Lotus fan, you should get a ZR1. And that's my final word.